Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer. Thanks to Keith S. for this one. Is it legal to reorder the cards in your graveyard? For such a simple problem statement, this is actually a really interesting question with a nuanced answer. I mean, on the one hand, you definitely see people rearranging their graveyard on a regular basis. For example, a blue-red Murktide player might pull out cards to make it easier to see whether Delirium is active. Or a player might preemptively move cards that can be flashed back to the top for convenience. On the other hand, the existence of cards like Nether Shadow or Phyrexian Furnace is pretty strong indirect evidence that the graveyard should have a definite immutable order. Even Fossil Find lends some credence to this point. I mean, why would it let you reorder your graveyard afterwards? It doesn't make any sense from a flavor or a mechanical standpoint, but it certainly makes sense when you consider that the most natural way to randomly select a card from your graveyard is to shuffle them around and then pick one. So we've got this sort of weird situation where it doesn't seem like you should be able to change the order of cards in your graveyard, but people do it all the time anyway. Well, let's take a look at what the rules have to say. So as you can see here, it is not normally possible to change the order of cards in a graveyard. Although a card like Fossil Find from before could let you do it. Well, that's pretty interesting, but if we look at the rest of this rule, we can see the whole story. What we've just heard comes to us from the comprehensive rules, which means it applies, at least in principle, to every game of Magic. However, additional rules applying to sanctioned tournaments may allow a player to change the order of cards in their graveyard. So what would those rules be? Well, here is an excerpt from the Magic Tournament rules. As you can see, it more or less repeals that rule that we had on screen earlier, but only if you're playing in formats with an appropriate card pool. Players of Modern and formats with an earlier cutoff, such as Pioneer and Standard, can rearrange their graveyard till their heart's content. But if you're playing Legacy, Vintage, Pauper, and yes, even Commander, then you're officially bound to keep your graveyard in the proper order. I'd say this is my vote for the most broken rule in all of Magic. To give you an idea of what I mean, here's a couple of common examples. Let's say you're playing a Consider. Officially, the spell doesn't go into your graveyard until after all of its instructions have been performed. This means that if you choose to mill the top card, then it would go into your graveyard before the Consider does, as opposed to the lazy way that a lot of people do it, where the Consider goes straight to your graveyard as soon as an opponent says that it resolves, before even looking at the top card. Here's another one. If multiple cards are put into a player's graveyard at the same time, that player chooses their order. So if you play an Akroma's Vengeance, it doesn't matter what order everything gets put in, as long as the Akroma's Vengeance itself is put into your graveyard last. But the instructions of the spell are performed in the order that they're written down. So with something like this Austere command, which has separate instructions to destroy the artifacts and the creatures, then I'd better see everybody look through their cards that are getting destroyed in order to make sure that the artifacts get put into the graveyard first before the creatures. In case you're wondering, artifact creatures would go with the artifacts, since those get destroyed first. Then there's stuff like this Pyroclasm, which destroys creatures via damage. If you play a Pyroclasm while you control a Grizzly Bears, then the damage will be dealt, then the Pyroclasm will be put into your graveyard, then the Grizzly Bears, along with any other lethally damaged creatures that you may control, will be destroyed the next time state-based actions are performed. So unlike those other two cases, the Pyroclasm will actually go to the graveyard before any of the stuff that it kills. As a judge, the only policy-based justification for not giving a game rule violation when players get sloppy in cases like these is that rule that I showed earlier, allowing players to reorder their graveyards in formats that support it. Officially, at competitive rules enforcement level, any of these cases would be ground for a penalty otherwise. Which leads me to the last point that I wanted to talk about today, a practical one. If you've never heard of this rule before today, you're certainly not alone. Why doesn't this come up more often? Anecdotally, I haven't seen a single penalty for incorrect graveyard order handed out in almost a decade of judging. Well, first off, the formats where it's relevant aren't very popular formats for tournaments. In most games of sanctioned Magic, it's perfectly permissible for players to reorder their graveyards. Even in the formats where you can't, most of the cards where the graveyard order matters just aren't very good. Perhaps the best one is Shallow Grave, although Deathspark enjoyed a long stint of Tier 1 playability in Pauper, and Nether Shadow occasionally sees play in graveyard-based decks in Legacy and Vintage. After that, the drop in playability is pretty steep. Since the cards in question don't show up very frequently, a lot of people believe that the extra attention required to make sure everything gets in their graveyard in the proper order isn't really worth the largely theoretical gains in gameplay integrity. A lot of casual groups are governed by an unspoken gentleman's agreement along the lines of, you can do whatever you want with your graveyard as long as it doesn't matter for anything. And this ethos does spill over to some extent into competitive play as well. Of course, judges won't look the other way if someone is actually playing Graveyard Order Matters cards, but a lot of us might start with a caution and some education rather than a formal penalty in cases where it's clear the player who broke this rule did it unintentionally, out of respect for the fact that it just doesn't come up very often. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to have too heavy of a hand in those cases. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.